Shortly after midnight, on August 7th, 1944, the village of Mortain in Normandy lay under a thick summer fog. The hedgerows were silent, the orchards were silent, and then, just before dawn, the eastern horizon began to fill with engine noise. A column of German tanks, part of the 2nd SS Panzer Division known as Das Reich, was grinding up the narrow road below a rocky outcrop the Americans called Hill 314. They had been moving since the small hours, racing west to cut the American Third Army in half and reach the coast at Barrages. Adolf Hitler himself had ordered the attack. 4 panzer divisions, plus elements of the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division, had been thrown into it. The code name was Operation Lüttich, and it was meant to be the killing blow that turned the tide in France. On top of the hill, in the rocky pasture above the town, a young lieutenant from the 230th Field Artillery Battalion of the 30th Infantry Division lifted his radio handset. His name was Robert L. Weiss. As the morning fog began to thin, he could see German vehicles moving in the valley below. He gave the call sign. He read off the coordinates. He waited. What happened next was something the German army had no answer for. There was no warning whistle. There was no ranging shot. There was no slowly creeping curtain of fire walking toward the column. Instead, in a single sledgehammer instant, the road, the orchard, the hedgerow, and the meadow on either side all exploded together. Rounds from 12 different American battalions, fired from positions miles apart, all arrived in the same heartbeat. By the time the first German driver heard the noise, his vehicle was already burning. It was called a time on target. The Germans called it the most terrifying sound in the war. And in this story, we are going to look at why the most professional, most experienced gunners in Europe, the men of the Wehrmacht, simply could not do it back. Not at Mortain, not at Elsenborn Ridge, not at the Sauer River, not anywhere. This is the story of an American invention that killed more German soldiers than any tank, any rifle, or any bomber. And it is the story of why the Germans, no matter how hard they tried, could never copy it. The technique itself sounds almost simple. A time on target, sometimes shortened to TOT, was an artillery mission in which every gun, no matter where it was sitting on the battlefield, fired its shells at a different moment so that all of those shells landed on the target at the exact same instant, not within a minute, not within 10 seconds, within plus or minus 3 seconds. To understand why that mattered, you have to understand what artillery actually does to human beings. Studies done by the United States Army after the war confirmed something every infantryman already knew. When a shell lands, the men who get hit first are the men who are still standing. Within 2 seconds of the first explosion, most soldiers have dropped to the ground. Within 8 seconds, almost all of them are flat on their stomachs behind whatever cover they can find. After that, the next shell, and the next, and the next, kill far fewer men, because the targets have already gone to ground. In a normal artillery barrage, the shells arrive in a long, uneven rhythm. The first round gives the men on the receiving end a warning. The second round arrives a second or two later. The men dive for cover. By the time the heavy concentration is falling, most of them are already as safe as they are going to get. A time on target removes that warning. There is no first round. There is no second round. There is only one round, multiplied across an entire battlefield, arriving everywhere at the same moment. Soldiers caught in the open at the moment of impact have no time to react. They are simply gone. The mathematics required to do this are not trivial. Every gun is sitting at a different distance from the target. A 105mm howitzer firing from 8 kilometers out has a different time of flight than a 155mm Long Tom firing from 16 kilometers out. The shell from the closer gun reaches the target faster, so the gun crews have to fire in reverse order. The most distant battery fires first. The closest battery fires last. If the timing is right, all of those shells, traveling on completely different arcs and trajectories, cross the sky and converge on a single patch of earth in the same instant. The British were the first to try it. In late 1941 and early 1942, in the deserts of North Africa, British gunners began synchronizing their watches by listening to the time signal pips broadcast by the British Broadcasting Corporation, the famous BBC. Once their watches were aligned to the same second, they could time their fire. The Americans took the idea, studied it, refined it, and, more importantly, built an entire system around it that the British themselves could not match in scale. That system did not begin in 1944. It began on the dusty plains of Oklahoma, more than a decade before the war. The home of American field artillery is a place called Fort Sill. It was opened as the School of Fire in 1911. By the late 1920s, it had become the laboratory in which the most important artillery innovation of the 20th century was being quietly invented. A major named Carlos Brewer had taken over the gunnery department. Brewer had graduated at the top of his class at the Command and General Staff College, and he had a problem he wanted to solve. In the First World War, American artillery had been good, but it had been slow. Each battery computed its own firing data. If a regiment wanted 3 battalions to fire on the same target, 3 different sets of officers had to do 3 different sets of math, sometimes from 3 different maps. By the time everyone agreed on the answer, the target had often moved. Brewer wanted to centralize that. He wanted one room, one set of charts, one set of computers that could direct the fire of every gun within range, regardless of which battery they belonged to. He called it a Fire Direction Center. His successor, Major Orlando Ward, built the first one. A third officer, Lieutenant Colonel H.L.C. Jones, refined it and pushed it through the Field Artillery School. And in the spring of 1931, on the firing ranges of Fort Sill, the first proof of concept was carried out. An entire battalion, 12 guns, massed its fire on a single target, with all data computed from a single chart. Watching all of this was a quiet, white-haired lieutenant colonel named Leslie J. McNair. He would be remembered later as the man who built the United States Army of World War II. As a field artillery instructor at Fort Sill in the late 1920s, he had helped pioneer the modern teaching methods that would later mass-produce trained artillery officers. As commander of the Army Ground Forces beginning in 1942, he embedded the Fire Direction Center concept in every infantry division the United States ever shipped overseas. McNair would not live to see the system at its peak. On July 25, 1944, in a Norman field outside St. Lo, a stick of bombs from the American 8th Air Force fell short during the carpet bombing that opened Operation Cobra. One of those bombs landed in the slit trench where McNair had crouched to watch his system in action. His body was thrown 60 feet. He was identified only by the 3 stars on his collar. He remains the highest-ranking American officer killed in combat in the European theater. He is buried in the Normandy American Cemetery. There was one more piece. In November of 1940, a captain named Abbott Harrington Burns walked into the Fire Direction Center team at Fort Sill. He had been a clerk for an Arizona telephone company before the war. In a single evening of experimentation, he invented a logarithmic slide rule he called the graphical firing table. It looked like a simple ruler with sliding scales. What it did was let an enlisted man with grocery store arithmetic compute a firing solution more than 20 times faster than a trained officer working from a 76-page book of tables. The graphical firing table, paired with the Fire Direction Center, was the engine of every American time-on-target mission. By 1944, the system worked like this. A forward observer somewhere near the front, often a lieutenant in a foxhole or a young pilot in a tiny unarmed airplane, spotted a target. He picked up a radio handset and called back to the Fire Direction Center of his battalion. The operations officer, the S3, made one decision. How many guns did this target deserve? A platoon, a battery, a battalion, a regiment, a division, sometimes an entire corps. If the answer was an entire corps, 200 or more guns, scattered across 30 kilometers of battlefield, would all be told to fire on the same point of Earth. The Fire Direction Center calculated the time of flight for each battery, ordered each one to fire at a different second, and the rounds would arrive together. From the moment the forward observer called for fire to the moment the first round detonated was about 3 minutes. 3 minutes. 3 minutes to silence anything in the open. It is worth slowing down and looking at what was actually happening in that tent in the rear. A Fire Direction Center for an American artillery battalion during the war typically operated out of 2 squad tents, pitched end to end, blacked out at night, lit by hooded electric bulbs running off a portable generator. The walls were lined with map boards. The center of the tent held a large plotting table with the firing chart, on which every battery's position had been carefully surveyed and marked. Around that table stood the operations officer, the chief computer, and a small team of enlisted plotters and computers. When the call came in by radio, a clerk wrote it on a chit and slid it across the table. The grid coordinates were plotted. The range and azimuth from each battery were measured off in seconds. The chief computer ran the graphical firing table, calling out elevation in mils and powder charge by number. The fire direction officer checked the math and said the word that put it all into motion. Each battery received its own data, its own time of flight, and its own moment to fire. A loudspeaker in the tent announced the count. Outside, in 12 different gun pits across an area the size of a small town, 12 crews lifted shells, set fuzzes, and waited for the second hand on a single synchronized watch. When that second hand reached the agreed mark, all of them pulled the lanyard. A good battalion could be loaded, laid, and firing within 90 seconds of the order, leaving the fire direction center. The rounds were already in the air before the German formation on the receiving end had any reason to look up at the sky. The Germans never had this. Not because they were not good gunners, they were excellent gunners, but because their entire system, from doctrine down to hardware, was built differently. To understand the Gulf, look at the equipment that made the American system work. The standard American Infantry Division of 1944, what was called a triangular division, contained 3 regiments of infantry. Each regiment was directly supported by a battalion of 12 105mm M2 A1 howitzers. That gave the division 36 light howitzers. On top of that, the division had a 4th battalion of 12 155mm M1 howitzers for general support, 54 guns in every American infantry division. Behind those divisions sat the Corps artillery. The Corps brought the heavy hitters. The 155mm long tom gun, more than 20 feet of barrel, throwing a 95-pound shell well over 20,000 yards, about 13 miles. The 8-inch howitzer, considered one of the most accurate American guns of the war, and the 240mm howitzer, the largest American field piece of the war, which could pulverize a hardened bunker. When the United States 7th Corps surrounded Cherbourg in June of 1944, it could mass roughly 258 guns onto a single target. It expended around 140,000 rounds of artillery ammunition during the campaign that broke the Normandy front. One American field artillery battalion, the 945th, fired almost 60,000 shells between landing at Utah Beach in August of 1944 and the German surrender in May of 1945. A single battery, Battery C of the 337th Field Artillery Battalion, fired its 300,000th round on March 25, 1945. The German equivalent was thinner. A typical 1944 German infantry division had an artillery regiment of 4 battalions, 3 light battalions of 12 105mm howitzers, and 1 heavy battalion of 12 150mm howitzers. That added up to 48 guns on paper, but actual strengths were almost always lower. The new Volksgrenadier divisions of late 1944 sometimes had even fewer guns, and they had reorganized into smaller 6-gun batteries to spread their dwindling ammunition further. The mix of those guns was a quartermaster's nightmare. In his book on the Italian campaign, the historian Rick Atkinson noted that by the late war, half of the German artillery on the Eastern Front consisted of captured French guns. General Heinrich Eberbach, who commanded 5th Panzer Army in Normandy, complained in writing that his artillery contained pieces from every major European power: French Schneider guns, Czech howitzers, Polish guns, Soviet 76mm and 122mm pieces, Belgian, Yugoslav, and Italian artillery. Every one of those guns had a different time of flight curve. Every one of them needed a different firing table. A coordinated time on target requires standardized firing tables across all participating batteries. The Wehrmacht simply did not have them. The next piece is communications. This is the one most often missed. When Edwin Armstrong invented frequency modulation radio in the 1930s, the United States Army Signal Corps recognized its value almost immediately. Frequency modulation, called FM, is dramatically more resistant to electrical noise and battlefield interference than amplitude modulation, called AM. By 1944, every American forward observer was carrying or riding behind an FM voice radio, the SCR 300-man pack at the infantry battalion level. the SCR-608 and the SCR-610 in artillery vehicles. Quick, clear, reliable. The Wehrmacht used AM radios almost exclusively. Their main field sets, the Funkerat 5 family, ran on AM voice with around 10 to 20 watts of power. They worked, but they suffered from the noise of vehicles, the noise of nearby gunfire, atmospheric interference, and Allied jamming. When the link was poor, the Germans fell back on field telephone wire, which constantly got cut by shellfire and by Allied fighter bombers strafing the rear areas. The Germans only began to field FM sets in any number in the very last year of the war. By that time it was far too late to retool an entire army's command and control system. Above the wire and the radios sat one of the strangest American secret weapons of the war, a tiny civilian airplane painted olive drab. It was called the L-4 Grasshopper, and it was nothing more than a Piper Cub with a greenhouse skylight cut into the roof. It cruised at 75 miles per hour. It was unarmed. It was unarmored. 2 of them were assigned to every American artillery battalion. The Grasshopper made its combat debut on November 9, 1942, off the coast of Casablanca during the landings in North Africa. By 1944, those slow yellow airplanes were the eyes of the entire American artillery system. They cruised back and forth above the front, low and quiet, spotting targets, adjusting fire, and calling in time-on-target missions. A captured Japanese prisoner reportedly told American interrogators in the Pacific that he feared the Cubs more than any other Allied aircraft, because when the L-4s appeared overhead, artillery fire was always coming. The Wehrmacht had no equivalent. The Luftwaffe in 1944 had been driven from the skies of Western Europe. Henschel and Fiesler reconnaissance aircraft existed, but they could not fly low over Allied lines without being shot down. German artillery officers, blind from above, fought a different war. Behind all of this stood the most decisive American invention of the entire artillery story. It was a small glass tube about the size of a tube of lipstick, filled with a tiny radio transmitter, a receiver, an amplifier, and a battery. It was called the Radio Proximity Fuse. The American troops called it the VT, or simply the funny fuse. The proximity fuse had been a British concept first proposed in 1940. Engineering it for an artillery shell, however, was almost impossible, because the shell, when fired, has to survive a positive acceleration of around 5,000 g and a deceleration on rifling of around 9,000 g. Most electronics shatter. The Americans solved that problem at the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory under United States Navy contract. 22 million VT fuses were eventually produced by more than 100 manufacturers. The Sylvania plant in Ipswich, Massachusetts alone made over 5.5 million. The VT fuse worked by transmitting a tiny continuous radio signal as the shell flew. When the signal bounced back off the ground or off a target hard enough, the fuse fired the shell. The result was an air burst, exploding the shell roughly 30 to 50 feet above the target, rather than on contact with the ground. Against troops in foxholes without overhead cover, the effect was catastrophic. Shrapnel rained down from above instead of skidding sideways across the dirt. The first combat kill by a VT fuse took place on January 5, 1943, when the cruiser USS Helena shot down a Japanese dive bomber off Guadalcanal. For most of 1943 and 1944, the fuse was used only at sea, for fear that a dud would fall into German hands and be reverse-engineered. The combined chiefs of staff cleared it for use over land in October of 1944, but only against the German V-1 cruise missiles attacking Antwerp. It was not released for general use against German ground troops until December of 1944, when the Battle of the Bulge made it impossible to keep secret any longer. The Germans had begun work on a similar device in 1930. They never made it work. They never had it. Now you have the American picture. Standardized guns, standardized ammunition, FM radios, air observers, a fire direction center in every battalion, a graphical firing table in every command post, a radar set, called the SCR-584, capable of plotting incoming German shells and tracking them back to their batteries for counterfire, sound and flash ranging companies, and a fuse that turned every shell into an air burst. This is the system the Wehrmacht could not match. There were 8 reasons. The first was doctrine. The German army's foundational manual, Truppenführung, written in 1933, was a brilliant document. It emphasized maneuver, decision, and the concentration of force at a chosen point. Artillery existed to support that point of decision. Battery commanders worked closely with their assigned infantry battalion commanders, riding with them, sharing their tents, advancing alongside them. The doctrine was personal, intimate, and decentralized. The American doctrine was the opposite. American artillery was, in principle, available to any commander who needed it. The slogan was simple: artillery conquers, infantry occupies. The system was designed from the ground up to mass shells, not maneuver guns. The second was organization. Without a fire direction center at the corps level, German artillery had no efficient way to coordinate the fire of multiple battalions in real time. Massing fires in the German system required pre-plotted survey work, pre-selected targets, and detailed orders. Spontaneous massing of an entire corps onto a target of opportunity was effectively impossible. The third was communications, the AM radios, the cut wires, the lack of standardization across services. By 1944, German radio discipline had grown so brittle that the Allies were reading much of their traffic through Ultra at Bletchley Park. When General der Panzertruppe Hans Freiherr von Funk of the 47th Panzer Corps was ordered to attack at Mortain, the operation was given away in part because the 2nd Panzer Division broke radio silence on August 6 to ask for night fighter support. The Americans were waiting. The fourth was ammunition. The German economy never produced shells at the rate the Wehrmacht needed them. By 1941, even on the Eastern Front, German heavy batteries had only about 50 rounds per gun on hand. By the autumn of 1944, German artillery battalions in the West were being rationed to a few rounds per gun per day. Albert Speer's reorganization of war production lifted artillery output by a factor of 3.3 between 1941 and 1944. But even at peak 1944 production, German ammunition tonnage was still lower than the monthly output of the Imperial German Army in the First World War. American factories, meanwhile, produced 8,536 M2A1 howitzers during the war, and Rock Island Arsenal alone built more than 10,000 by 1953. 1 out of every 5 American shells fired during the war was a 105mm high-explosive round. The total American expenditure of artillery shells in the European theatre dwarfed German consumption by a factor of roughly 10 to 1. In Normandy, the 5th Panzer Army's artillery fired roughly 10% of what the British alone fired against it. The fifth was standardization. American artillery battalions in 1944 used 4 primary calibers, all manufactured to common specifications. Germany used dozens of calibers from a dozen captured countries. There is no way to coordinate a time on target across guns whose firing tables do not match. The 6th was training. Fort Sill mass-produced trained artillerymen on a scale the German system never approached. Officer candidate schools ran continuously. The Field Artillery School graduated thousands of officers and tens of thousands of enlisted Fire Direction Center computers. By the summer of 1944, German artillery officer attrition was severe. The skilled men who had built the system in 1939 and 1940 were dead, captured, or invalided home. The Volksartillerie Corps, formed in late 1944 to mass non-divisional fires, were chronically short of trained surveyors and computers. The 7th was air superiority. From the spring of 1944 onward, the Luftwaffe was effectively absent from the daytime skies of Western Europe. American L-4 Grasshoppers cruised the front at low altitude all day long. Sound and flash-ranging companies of the 16th Field Artillery Observation Battalion and others triangulated every German muzzle flash. The SCR-584 radar tracked incoming German shells back to their points of origin. The instant a German battery opened fire, its position was known to the Americans. American counter-battery missions silenced it within minutes. German batteries learned to fire and move, never settling, never massing. American batteries fired freely from prepared positions, day and night, and the German guns could not stop them. The 8th was the proximity fuse. The Germans had begun research on a radio fuse in 1930. 14 years later, they still did not have a working one. The Americans did. And when the VT fuse met the time-on-target technique in December of 1944, the result, in Patton's own words, was the deciding weapon of the Battle of the Bulge. You have now seen the system. Let us see it work. Return for a moment to Hill 314 at Mortain. The 700 men of the 2nd Battalion of the 120th Infantry Regiment, plus 2 forward observer teams of the 230th Field Artillery Battalion, were dug in on a stone outcrop overlooking the entire German line of advance. Lieutenant Robert L. Weiss of B Battery and Lieutenant Charles A. Bartz of C Battery, supported by their fire control sergeants, including a young Texan named Frank Denius, and had radios that worked. They had a clear view of the road. They had the ear of an entire Corps Fire Direction Center. For 5 days, beginning at dawn on August 7th, they called down Corps-level concentrations on every German tank, truck, infantry column, and assembly area that moved within their field of view. The 47th Panzer Corps had committed roughly 300 tanks. By the time the operation was called off on August 13, more than 120 of them had been destroyed. The Hill 314 perimeter, with more than 300 of its 700 men killed or wounded, never broke. Captain Reynolds C. Erickson took command after the battalion commander. Lieutenant Colonel Eads Hardaway was cut off in Mortontown. Major Richard E. Evans, Jr., the executive officer of the 230th Field Artillery, conceived a desperate experiment to fire medical supplies into the encircled American perimeter using shell canisters meant for propaganda leaflets. Robert Weiss, who adjusted the fire of those shells, later wrote that the effort was largely a failure. The shells flew too fast and hit too hard to deliver their cargo intact. But the men on Hill 314 held anyway, on rainwater and on whatever they had carried up with them. Decades later, in March of 2020, the 30th Infantry Division and the 230th Field Artillery Battalion were finally awarded the Presidential Unit Citation for the action. Weiss survived the war and wrote a memoir about it, called Fire Mission, The Siege at Mortain. Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge, then commanding German forces in the West, signalled Hitler's headquarters that no German tactic could compensate for the annihilating power of Allied air and artillery. Operation Lüttich, the offensive Hitler had promised would split the American army in two, never reached its first day's objectives. Within 8 days, the German 7th Army was retreating into the closing jaws of the Falaise pocket. Now, move forward 4 months. December 16, 1944. The Ardennes Forest, on the border between Belgium and Germany. 5:30 in the morning. Snow on the ground. Adolf Hitler had launched what would be remembered as the Battle of the Bulge. The German plan was to drive northwest across the Meuse River and recapture the port of Antwerp, splitting the British and American armies. The northern shoulder of the offensive ran into the United States Fifth Corps, commanded by Major General Leonard T. Guerreau, and specifically into a long forested ridge called the Elsenborn Ridge. Holding that ridge was the United States 2nd Infantry Division under Major General Walter M. Robertson, the United States 99th Infantry Division under Major General Walter Lauer, and elements of the United States 1st Infantry Division. The German plan called for the 12th SS Panzer Division, the 3rd Panzer Grenadier Division, and several Volksgrenadier divisions to break through the American line within 48 hours. They never did. The reason was artillery. On December 22, 1944, the divisional artillery of the United States 1st Infantry Division alone fired 10,000 rounds in a single day on German formations, attempting to break through at Dom Butgenbach. On the same fronts, the 2nd Infantry Division and the Corps Artillery were firing massed concentrations day and night, many of them now using the newly released VT fuse. American interrogation reports captured German testimony of the effect. One captured officer of the 12th Volksgrenadier Division told his interrogators that his veterans, men who had served on the Russian front through the worst Soviet bombardments of the war, had never experienced anything like it. It was during this fight, on the very first morning of the Bulge, that the VT fuse was first used in combat against German ground troops. Colonel George Axelson of the 406th Artillery Group released VT shells to support the 38th Cavalry Squadron at Monschau, before formal authorization had reached the front. By December 19, General Eisenhower had formally requested clearance, and within 2 days, all restrictions were lifted. By the time the Bulge ended, 200,000 VT shells had been delivered to the European theatre. The 246th Volksgrenadier Division attacked Elsenborn Ridge on December 26. According to the official history of the battle, that attack was annihilated by Corps artillery virtually at the moment of its start. The 6th SS Panzer Army never made its timetable. Antwerp was never threatened. The northern shoulder of the Bulge had been broken by guns. On the southern flank of the Bulge, on the night of December 25, 1944, a German battalion of the 212th Volksgrenadier Division was attempting to withdraw across the Sauer River near the Luxembourg town of Echternach. Patton's Third Army was driving north and east. The Germans, under pressure from Major General S. Leroy Irwin's 5th Infantry Division and Colonel Robert P. Pointer-7, Bell's 10th Infantry Regiment, part of Major General Mantonetti's 12th Corps, were trying to reach the cover of the eastern bank in the pre-dawn hours. They had wooden assault boats. They had a few small bridges. They thought the night and the river fog would protect them. A VT fused corps, time on target, hit the river and the riverbank at the same instant. American forward observers had registered every plausible crossing point in advance. When the German battalion was halfway across, all the rounds arrived together. Patton wrote about the action a few days later in a letter to the War Department, and later in his memoir, War as I Knew It. He described the new shell with the funny fuse as devastating. By Patton's own count, the Americans had killed 702 German soldiers in a single concentration. The figure was his estimate and never independently confirmed from German records, but the effect on the battalion was annihilating. He added that when all armies had this shell, the world would have to invent a new method of warfare. He was glad, he said, that the Americans had thought of it first. Captured German prisoners later told American interrogators of the terrific effect of the new artillery fuse on their formations. Patton, who was not a sentimental man about weapons, would later say flatly that the funny fuse won the Battle of the Bulge for the Americans. The Army's official history of the campaign considered that judgment an overstatement, noting that bad weather and other factors limited VT fuse use in the first weeks, but no one disputed the basic point. The combination of the new shell and the time on target had transformed what an American artillery battery could do. The Germans knew what was happening to them. They wrote about it. After the war, the United States Army Historical Division ran a program called the Foreign Military Studies, in which captured German generals were asked to write detailed accounts of their campaigns. Roughly 2,500 manuscripts were produced. The best of those manuscripts, the Bayerlein papers, the Manteuffel papers, the Mellenthin papers, return again and again to the same theme. The Americans could not always maneuver. They could not always plan. They could not always lead, but they could shoot. The most damning testimony came from Generalleutnant Fritz Bayerlein, who had commanded the famous Panzer Lehr Division during the carpet bombing and artillery bombardment that opened Operation Cobra on July 25, 1944. Bayerlein described that morning to American interrogators in language that has never been improved on. He said, "The bombers came as if on a conveyor belt." He said, "Back and forth, the carpets were laid." He said, "Artillery positions were wiped out, tanks overturned and buried, infantry positions flattened, and all roads and tracks destroyed." By midday, he said, the entire area resembled a moonscape, with bomb craters touching rim to rim. All signal communications had been cut, and no command was possible. The shock effect on the troops, he said, was indescribable. Several of his men, he added, went mad and rushed around in the open until they were cut down by splinters. And then he added the line that historians have quoted ever since. Simultaneously with the storm from the air, he said, innumerable guns of the American artillery poured drumfire into our field positions. Panzer Lehr, which had already been worn down to roughly 2,200 frontline soldiers before the bombing, lost about half of them in 24 hours. It never recovered as a fighting formation. Erwin Rommel had reached a similar conclusion more than a year earlier. From his time fighting the Americans and British in North Africa and Italy, he had grown used to seeing Allied observation aircraft direct the fire of numerous batteries on every worthwhile target. By the time he was commanding Army Group B in Normandy in the summer of 1944, his official reports were unsparing. He wrote that the enemy's tremendous superiority in artillery, even more than in the air, was breaking the German front open. He noted in his Normandy correspondence the great superiority of Allied artillery and the outstandingly large supply of ammunition. He died of suicide in October of that year, before the VT fuse and the time on target reached their full destructive partnership in the Ardennes. He had already understood what was coming. Field Marshal von Kluge, after Mortain, had said the same thing to Hitler's headquarters in different words. In the face of the total enemy air superiority and artillery, he wrote, no tactic could compensate. General Hermann Balck, who commanded Army Group G against Patton in Lorraine in late 1944, was a more difficult case. Balck declined for years to take part in the foreign military studies. But in 1979, in a series of taped conversations with American officers at the Battelle Memorial Institute and the BDM Corporation, he finally discussed the campaigns in detail. Balck had his own ideas about American shortcomings, particularly what he saw as rigid phase lines and excessive caution. But he never denied the simple fact that the Americans had outshot the Germans. His own preferred method of war, rapid decision and concentration of force in time, was a way of compensating for an artillery imbalance he could not fix. There is a quieter part of this story that is sometimes lost. American gunners themselves were not unaware of what they had built. Major General George S. Patton, who commanded the Third Army from August of 1944 onward, was almost obsessive about artillery. In a letter of instruction issued to his commanders on April 3, 1944, he wrote that mortars and artillery were superb weapons when they were firing, but junk when they were silent, and ordered his officers to keep them firing. After the war, in a speech to a veterans audience, he is reported to have said simply that he did not have to tell his listeners who had won the war. They knew. The artillery did. General Omar Bradley, who commanded the 12th Army Group, was a more reserved man, but his description of the death of Leslie J. McNair, on July 25, 1944, is one of the most vivid passages of his memoirs. Bradley wrote that the ground belched, shook, and spewed dirt to the sky. Scores of American troops were hit, their bodies flung from slit trenches. Doughboys were dazed and frightened. A bomb landed squarely on McNair in a slit trench and threw his body 60 feet and mangled it beyond recognition except for the 3 stars on his collar. McNair was buried in Normandy. He was posthumously promoted to general in 1954, 10 years after his death. The historian Michael Doubler wrote in his book, Closing with the Enemy, that by the summer of 1944, the field artillery had proved itself to be the most brilliant performer in the American Combined Arms Team. Russell Weigley, in Eisenhower's Lieutenants, would conclude that overwhelming firepower was the central characteristic of the American way of war, and that the limits of that firepower, when they appeared, were the limits set by ammunition shipping rather than by any technique on the German side. The numbers, in the end, told the story. Of all American battlefield deaths in the European theatre, 64% were caused by artillery and mortar fire. In the Mediterranean theatre, the number was 69.1%. In the Pacific theatre, it was 47%. By comparison, small arms accounted for roughly 14 to 30%, depending on the theatre. The shell, not the rifle, was the killing instrument of the Second World War. The American consumption of artillery ammunition, measured against rifle and machine gun rounds, ran at roughly 1 to 48 by the last year of the war. The Soviet ratio was 1 to 15. The German ratio was 1 to 18. The American war was, more than any other industrial nation's war, a war of shells. The ammunition factories that supported it have mostly been demolished. The thousands of M2A1 howitzers built for the war ended up in the armories of allies on every continent. The L-4 Grasshoppers were sold off as surplus, and many of them are still flying as private aircraft. The SCR-584 radar sets were upgraded into post-war tracking systems and eventually into the early space tracking networks of the 1950s. The VT Fuse, declassified after the war, is the direct technological ancestor of every guided weapon in the modern arsenal. Only the Field Artillery School at Fort Sill is still doing exactly what it did in 1931. New officers still learn the principles Brewer and Ward and Jones laid down. The graphical firing table that Captain Burns sketched out one evening has been replaced first by the Field Artillery Digital Automated Computer and then by the Advanced Field Artillery Tactical Data System. But the underlying technique, the centralized fire direction, the synchronized time of flight, and the plus or minus 3-second standard for impact has not changed. American gunners today still call for time-on-target missions. Soldiers in Ukraine, in 2024 and 2025, are still being killed by them. The doctrine has outlived almost everyone who built it. It is worth pausing on what that means. The conventional picture of the Second World War in Europe is a picture of tanks, Sherman tanks, Tiger tanks, Panzer divisions racing across plains. Or it is a picture of the air war, of B-17s flying through flak over Berlin, of P-51s dueling Messerschmitts, of Stuka dive bombers screaming down on retreating columns. Those pictures are not wrong, but they are not the whole truth. Most of the Germans who died in the West were not killed by tanks, and they were not killed by airplanes. They were killed by guns they never saw, fired by men they never met, on coordinates whispered into a radio handset by a young lieutenant in a foxhole or by a pilot in a small yellow airplane, and then plotted on a chart in a tent miles to the rear, and then computed by an enlisted man with a slide rule, and then fired so that all of those shells, from a dozen different places, would arrive in the same instant. The men who built that system are mostly forgotten today. Carlos Brewer, Orlando Ward, H.L.C. Jones, Jacob Devers, Abbott Burns, Leslie J. McNair, the forward observers like Robert Weiss and Charles Bartz who lay on stone hilltops with a radio and a map, the L-4 pilots, most of them very young, who flew unarmed and slow above the front, and who lived only because the Luftwaffe was no longer in the air to shoot them down. The enlisted men in the fire direction centers who passed numbers back and forth across charts in the half-dark. None of them are famous. None of them have movies made about them. But it was their work that decided most of the fights this story has touched. Hill 314 at Morton held because a lieutenant on a stone hilltop could call down a corps. Elsenborn Ridge held because the 1st Infantry Division could fire 10,000 rounds in a day. The Sauer River became a graveyard because Patton had been given a new shell and a system that delivered it on time. Operation Cobra broke open the Western Front because Bayerlein's tanks were buried under their own dirt before they could move. When the United States Ninth Army crossed the Rhine on the night of March 23, 1945, the assault was preceded by one of the largest synchronized artillery preparations of the war. Thousands of guns along the western bank fired for hours into German positions on the eastern shore. What had begun as a quiet Fort Sill demonstration with 12 guns in 1931 had become, by the spring of 1945, a coordinated industrial barrage from thousands of guns striking the heart of Germany itself. Patton called it the deciding weapon. Bradley called it the brilliant performer. Bayerlein called it drumfire from a moonscape sky. The men of Hill 314 called it the only reason they were still alive. The Americans had built something that had never quite existed before, a way of making time itself a weapon. And they had built it almost in secret, on an Oklahoma firing range, while the rest of the world was looking somewhere else. That is why the Germans could not match the time on target, and that is why so many American sons came home, and so many German sons did not.